I am George Snyder, a veteran of World War II in the European theater, and welcome you to our program, Shooting from the Hip. This is an unrehearsed impromptu program wherein we hear firsthand accounts from veterans of World War II and their experiences. We hope to get veterans from all the branches of service, the Army, Navy, Air Corps, Marines, and Coast Guard, and from theaters all over the world where American military served. Today's guest is a veteran of the U.S. Army Air Corps. Notice I say U.S. Army Air Corps. This was in before 1946. At that time, the Air Corps was part of the Army, and then in 1946, they got their own terminology, and it's now called the U.S. Air Force. So meet David Fisher, U.S. Air Corps.
I appreciate being here, George.
Okay, David, tell us, how did you end up in the Air Force?
Well, I was a senior. I graduated from high school in 1943, and I was still just 17 years old, too young to go into the service, but as was the case all over the country, young people like me were going into some branch of the service as soon as they were able to. So in November, my birthday was the 12th of December, so on the 11th of November, I was able to enlist in the Army Aviation Cadet Program. I guess I saw myself being a pilot or something, flying an airplane. I don't know. So I went into the active service on the 22nd of December, along with 30 or 40 other young guys like myself from my section of the state.
Okay, but this was in the Air Force. I mean,
yeah, the Air Corps.
So
yeah.
You were assigned the Air Force.
We went, just to carry it a little bit further, we went from there, all 30 or 40 of us went to Gulfport Field, Mississippi, which was a temporary base for first-time entrance. So while we were there, we learned how to march and military stuff, shooting guns and stuff. Okay. But 1 week while we were there, they sent us down to Keesler Army Air Force Base, which was a permanent base.
Yeah, right next door.
And they gave us all kinds of tests, classification tests. Well, by that time, they had picked all the pilots, navigators, bombardiers they needed, so none of us made the cadet program. But I ended up being selected to go to a radio school.
Okay, so this is the first introduction to the radio.
Yes.
School.
That's right.
So that involved several different camps in the States. It didn't.
Yeah, I didn't know an ohm from a volt from nothing. I didn't know anything about it. But to the credit of our government, they had some great educational systems. They sent me to Scottsfield, Illinois, and so I had to learn the Morse code, and I had to learn theory of radio and stuff like that. So we were at Scottsfield for about 22 or 3 weeks.
Okay, that's a long time. So did you learn the technology of radio? Could you take them apart and fix them?
Yeah, we did learn that. Yes, we had to learn that, but fundamentally, about half the time that we spent in class was on that.
Okay.
And the other half was learning the Morse code and sending and receiving Morse code.
Yeah.
And at the end of that time, the fundamental radio course was about 22 weeks, and I finished that. And at that point, there would have been three things. One was going to gunnery school to be a radio gunner on a B-17, B-24 or something. The other one was a ground radar situation. The other was a B-29 radio school. Well, we didn't even know what a B-29 looked like then. But they sent the equipment down, and we learned for another 2 or 3 weeks, and we learned to operate all the radio equipment on that at Scott Field.
Okay, so after all this training, you met your crew that you were going to.
Yes. Okay. When I got through with that B-29 radio school, we had what they call that delay en route. I hadn't been home since I'd gotten the service, but they gave us 14 days to get to Lincoln, Nebraska, and that was where our crew was assembled. You know, they would send radio operators, gunners, pilots, navigators, bombardiers there, and selected an 11-man crew, 5 officers and 6 enlisted men at that base. We didn't stay there, but maybe a week or 2 weeks.
So, as a radio operator, what do you do on a bombing mission?
Well, you know, to tell you what, to back up a little bit, I didn't go far enough with the other thing. After our crew was assembled, we went by train to Clovis, New Mexico, and that was to be our flight training there. And so we stayed there about 6 months and flew on B-29s doing different things. But I learned to operate all those items of radio on there. There was a lot of I had to use the code, you know, Morse code and stuff. But also there were other radio pieces of equipment that I had to learn how to use.
So once you got your all this training, you're waiting for your B-29, and I understand the B-29s had a lot of mechanical problems, especially with the engines.
They did.
Did this delay getting your B-29?
Well, you know what, that's an interesting question, because when we first got to Clovis, they didn't even have a B-29 for us to train in at first. Okay. But they were in the process of getting enough for every crew. But we flew. First, I flew in B-17 to operate the radio from there. But so most of our training missions were not on B-17s, but were on B-29s. But they were still manufacturing them when we got to Clovis. Yeah. We trained as a replacement crew at Clovis, right. So they didn't even have a B-29 for every single crew that was there. You had to take turns flying them.
Okay, well let's get your crew onto the plane, and what's it like flying over the Pacific, and what were you heading for? Were you heading for Guam or?
Well, we ended up, after we got our flight training in Clovis, New Mexico, we went to Kearney, Nebraska, which was the overseas staging area for B-29s. And there they lectured to us on a lot of stuff, and they gave us a B-29 there. Yeah. And we thought we were going to spend the rest of the war on that B-29. So we stayed there for a while, and then we flew from there to Sacramento, California, Mather Field, and that was the stepping off point to go overseas. So we flew from there to Saipan, which is in the Mariana Islands, yeah. And that we joined another group there because the group that we ended up in trained as an entire unit at Salina, Kansas, but we trained individually at Clovis, New Mexico. So we flew over to Saipan. No sooner were we there and taxiing to take over, they took our plane away from us and gave it to another crew that flew out of Saipan that had trouble with the airplane. So we were assigned to the 39th Bomb Group, which operated out of Guam, and that's where we spent the rest of the war.
So there were 3 islands in the Marianas where the B-29s flew out of. There was Guam, Saipan, and Tinian.
Yes.
Tinian was where the Enola Gay left from, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, did you fly all your missions out of Guam?
We flew all of them out of Guam, yes.
Okay, 22 missions. And were most of these over Japan?
All of them over Japan. Yeah.
And of course, this was near the end of the war. Japan was not all that powerful anymore. Of course, they were desperate. So, did you get any very much anti-aircraft fire?
Yeah, we did, but there surely wasn't as much of that in Japan as there was in Europe.
Yeah.
But you always ran into it. We flew 2 types of missions. We flew daylight missions and then a lot of night missions. The daylight missions were flown, of course, in formation, and that's when you would expect to see the flak, more of it. Mm-hmm. and the Japanese fighters. But we didn't get much resistance during our daylight fighter. I was in the darkest part of that airplane, I guess, so I didn't see what a lot of other people saw. The radio position was against the wall or against the fuselage, and it didn't have a window to look out of. But we did get flak, but not anywhere near what they got in Europe.
These three bases could house 1,000 B-29s, I understand.
Oh yeah, they would. There were 5 wings. The structure of the 20th Air Force was wings, and then groups, and then squadrons.
Okay.
The first wing was a 58th Bomb Wing, and it had started out in India. And when we got control of the Marianas Islands, it went to Tinian. Then the 73rd Wing came in. It was on Saipan. We were in the 314th Bomb Wing, and we ended up on Guam. The 315th Bomb Wing was also on Guam.
Okay. Now, what was I going to ask you about the bombing missions to Japan? What kind of planes were you in a squadron then, or what? How many planes were involved?
The structure of it, as I said, there were daylight missions and night missions. So whenever a crew was picked to fly a mission, they would list that crew number on a board, and the session, critique session before the mission, they'd wake us up about 3 o'clock in the morning, and we go to there, and then they would tell you where you're going to fly. They would also give you a position in a formation for the daylight missions. We'd get to the flight line probably about 6 o'clock in the morning, and we'd fly you didn't fly the formation all the way up. It would have taken too much fuel. So you could see a lot of B-29s in the air going up there, but there was an assembly point off of the coast, a peninsula or something, and you'd circle around and around because you were given your position in the formation, and sometimes that took a little while. And then, of course, the lead plane would go to what they call the IP, or initial point, and the lead plane would take the heading that would put that formation over the target that was to be hit. That was the daylight missions. Mm-hmm. The night missions, we'd usually try to, and the bombs there would drop during the middle of the day, to where our day missions were 16 and a half hours long, mm-hmm. because of that extra flying. The night missions, we would take off, and the bombs would be dropped in the middle of the night, but it was individual in nature. Didn't take as much fuel. It took a lot more fuel for the day missions.
But how many planes would be in that?
There was wave after wave, but an individual formation would probably.
A few hundred, or?
I'm sorry?
A few hundred, or?
Oh God, there were some. You mentioned something. There were probably 1,800 missions flown. Planes. That many crews there. Now, sometimes there could be that many planes over Japan on a given night or given day. Not all of them would be on the same target. Sometimes there might be 4 targets hit. But if it was a bigger, more expansive target, you'd have wave after wave of B-29s going there. To where any given day, that could be 800 to 1,000 airplanes over a target in Japan.
In the event of maybe a few Zeros attacking you, did you remain at the radio, or do you have a gun position?
No, the radio operator on the V-29 did not have a gun position. Okay. They trained us to be the first aid guy on the crew to kind of doctor up anybody that might be hurt. Now, that happened only one time, and we had flown a very low-lying mission at night, an incendiary mission, and the tail gunner got bounced around that little section, got skinned up, and I had to doctor him up. What was I going to say now? Of all these runs, they were all bombing runs. Did you have any other runs that were not bombing runs? Well, one, didn't you? Yeah, we had the last mission that we flew was a POW mission. Yeah. After the war, we flew on the last combat mission of the war, which is the 15th of August. You know, the atomic bombs were dropped on the 6th and the 9th of August. And I guess the Americans were waiting on for the Japanese to surrender, and they never did. Bombing. So on a given night, on the 14th, 15th of August, there were 4 more targets scheduled to be hit. And there were about, you know, there were probably 700, 800 B-29s on not on each one, but on separate ones. So we flew that, and before we flew that, they gave us a key to where if the Japanese, in fact, said they would surrender, well, then we would abort the mission, go home, drop the bombs in the ocean, go home. But we did not get that. So we did like those other 3 missions, dropped the bombs, came back. We were short of fuel coming home, so we had to stop at Iwo Jima to refuel. And while we were at Iwo Jima, we found out that, in fact, the Japanese had indicated they would surrender.
Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the B-29. Of course, everyone knows that the Enola Gay was a B-29, and that's the only plane they seem to hear about. Like you say, though, you had thousands of planes that went on missions and shortened the war in Japan quite a bit, but you don't hear too much about that. But now, in Europe, we didn't have any B-29s. The biggest ones we had were the B-17, the B-24. They were good bombers, and the British had a larger one, the Lancaster, which carried a bigger bomb load. And about the only sophisticated equipment that the B-17 and the B-24 had were the Norton bomb sight. But the B-29 had a lot of sophisticated equipment, a lot of radar equipment that our planes didn't have. Were you familiar with radar, or do you have a radar?
Yeah, we had a radar. One of the 6 officers on our crew was a radar navigator, but the regular navigator was up in the nose of the plane. There was 6 of us in the nose of the plane in front of the forward bomb bay, and the navigator was up there. The radar navigator, he was a navigator but specialized in radar. His position was in the rear section of the plane. But you're right in saying that, I mean, I'm familiar, of course, with the B-17, and it's a shame that the B-29, I say ashamed, I mean, you take what you got and go with it, but the B-29, one of the significant things about it was its gunnery system. It was the cabin was pressurized, number one, so the gunners did not have direct control of their guns. There was an electronically controlled gun sight, and on a given mission, depending upon where you were in the formation, the gunner would start off with a given set of guns. You know, there were 4 50s on the nose, top nose, 2 on the bottom, and then 2 more turrets in the back top. So they would go into a formation knowing that they had these guns. But there was one of the gunners was called a central fire control gunner, and by throwing electrical switches, he could transfer, you can say, the ownership of whatever guns they had to where instead of 2 guns, a gunner might be pointing 6 50 caliber guns. So the Japanese, they couldn't get very close to it. I think a single B-29 flying up there could pretty well defend itself.
So once I understand this radar was so sophisticated that it could lock in on a target, and then this information was relayed to the automatic fire control, and then they locked in on the target. Yeah. And once they did that, that was goodbye target, right? Yeah,
3 or 4. You know, I'm not as knowledgeable about that as I would be about a few other things. But yes, there were several. You know, the information I kept on our missions. I had information on there that some of the bombing runs were made on radar, and when you're in overcast or something like that. Yes.
Well, that's just like getting that red laser dot on you when from a handgun. Once that's on you, that's goodbye. So understand that radar was extremely effective. I spoke to someone else who trained on B-29s in that specific area.
I want to back up a little bit. One of the things, you know, you talked about flak earlier and the B-17s. I've always felt that that was just a terrific airplane, but they had to fly so high to try to get above the flak, and they were since our guys had our plane was pressurized. Their guns were not right there. Their guns were halfway, down the plane from where they were.
Okay. Of the 22 missions, do you have any particular one that stands out, more interesting or more exciting than any other?
Well, you know, one of the we flew 21 combat missions, and there was one that the worst one was Kagoshima, which is in the southern part of Kyushu, and it was a night mission. We flew about 7,000 feet, and there were a lot of fires already burning there, and they created heat thermals because the air would get heated up, and as you're flying through that, if the heat thermals would, if it was just under one wing of the plane, it would tilt it, or sometimes you might be 500, 600, 700, 800 feet higher in altitude, so you bounced around. I heard stories, didn't happen to us, but I've heard stories that it even flipped some of the B-29s on its back, and so that was a tough one. The other interesting mission was the POW mission that we dropped because we were flying very low for that, and we had to load the stuff that we dropped, and I don't even know who put the parachutes on, but we dropped it to an American POW camp. And it was interesting because we flew up very low altitude and we got to see more of the countryside.
You have a couple pictures here just before we shut down here, if you care to show this.
Well, these are of interest. This is a picture of our crew that was taken when we were training at Clovis, New Mexico. The top 5 guys are the officers, and the ones down below are the enlisted guys. This was taken in 1945, just before we left to go overseas. The other picture that's meaningful, I think, this airplane, for a while, it's a B-29 that for a while it was developed and made to fly by the Commemorative Air Force, and for a while it was the only B-29 flying. Since then, there's one more in the United States that's flying, but this is the airplane that we flew on. This one is called Fifi. Another picture that I had access to is this one right here. This picture right here, this was a picture that I got from the World War II Museum, and this was taken on Tinian. And this was where where the atomic bomb was dropped from. So that airplane is being backed into position to where it was over the bomb that was carried. This was taken, of course, during the war, and this is just the people waiting around to see what was happening there. The P on on the tail of that plane in the background is on the 39th, was from the 39th Bomb Group. When I saw that, it interested me a lot because I just couldn't figure out why a plane from our group was on Tinian leading up to the dropping of that bomb. Anyway, we flew traditional missions, and I think that it bothered me a little bit that the B-29 has been associated only with the atomic bomb, but there were many traditional missions that were dropped.
Okay. Do you have any other comments you'd like to make?
No, I appreciate being able to share this. It's I was just a kid when I went into the service, like so many other thousands of people, not knowing anything about anything relating to what I ended up doing. And it's been meaningful to me to have had that experience, and also to share it with people who fought on the other side of the ocean like you did, and learn what happened over there.
We're all kids, 17, 18. I just saw some statistics the other day on the Vietnam War, and almost 33,000 of them were 18-year-olds, and the majority were all 18 to 24, something like that. So, it was a young time and naivety and growing up, right? So after the war, did you pursue your education? with the
Yes, I
GI
did.
Bill?
I started college when I got out of the service. I got out of the service in late December of 1945, and it was too late to start college at that time. So I started it was in Southwestern Louisiana Institute, which is now the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. And I played football and ran track there, and then I ended up coaching for a while on the high school level. And
Okay. Well, thank you for an interesting interview,
I
David.
appreciate it, enjoyed it.
And I hope our TV audience enjoyed the show, and look forward to our next one when we'll be shooting from the hip. We salute you.
That's good.
Yeah, that went well.
You did